I think he said a long time ago something bad. You know, when they say bad about me, I don't forget.
I mean, what they did was terrible. They made up a fake statement by President Reagan. Reagan was a big supporter of tariffs.
Very bothered by this, especially because the ad was using Ronald Reagan, someone that the president has talked about, someone who the president sees as a stalwart of the Republican Party.
This week, President Trump managed to irritate nearly 38% of the world's population, from Canada to Russia, China, and even Venezuela. And it's a reminder that in Trump's world, chaos isn't a byproduct, it's the plan. In just a few days, he terminated trade talks with Canada, tightened sanctions on Russia, which affects the Indians as well. And this is only days after promising to meet President Vladimir Putin in Budapest. And right before sitting down with President Xi at APEC Summit, the United States has launched an investigation into China's trade compliance with the Phase 1 part of the deal, which was signed under the first Trump administration in 2020. And let's not even talk about the US strikes on the Venezuelan boat that killed 6 people, 4 continents in up arms. Now, his belief in disruption diplomacy remains firm, though. The world will only respect the United States if it acts and is strong, according to him. So each move, from cutting off Canada to cornering Russia and confronting China, fits into Trump's broader attempt to reassert leverage in a multipolar world that no longer bends easily to Washington. Now, the problem is, if even Canada, your closest ally and neighbor, is highlighting the hypocrisy of the president's initiatives, then who can take you seriously? And it doesn't help when the president himself posts videos flying a military jet, wearing a crown, dropping what can only be taken as brown feces on the United States protesters last week, saying that they didn't want a king. And what were they doing? They were protesting against what they see as an increasingly authoritarian approach being taken by the Trump administration against freedoms of speech, if you think of the universities, ICE actions, as well as against that bigger militarization attempt that he's making in major cities by sending in the National Guards. Donald Trump, in turn, is worried about the Supreme Court, which has scheduled oral arguments for November the 5th, 2025 this year, for the case challenging his sweeping tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Now, the case has global trade implications, and a ruling against the administration could prompt billions of dollars of refunds to companies that paid those tariffs, and it will reshape US trade and executive power going forward. Now, the court has expedited the case, so the ruling could be issued before the end of 2025. Throughout this, China is staying calm and has laid out what it wants from the trade talks and is not budging as is wanted by the Americans. And while North America is unraveling over these tariffs and Europe is melting down over chips, and let me give you here an update on the Nexperia fiasco, which you may know is the Chinese company that the Netherlands expropriated a couple of weeks ago. My last 2 vlogs cover this. Now, it has not even been 1 month, and already the EU vehicle manufacturers are being seriously hit. Volkswagen is Germany's largest automaker, and unless a solution can be found quickly, some analysts are estimating that German car production could fall as much as 1/3 in a worst-case scenario, while a more likely scenario is probably a 10% fall, but that's also bad. Chancellor Merz of Germany recently told journalists that we won't accept what is happening right now. However, guess what happened recently? The German Foreign Minister Wadenfall had to cancel his trip to China because no one wants to meet with him. The cancellation of the visit to China is a diplomatic disaster, noted the German newspaper Die Welt. It's a diplomatic embarrassment that just underscores how cold Europe and China relations have become. Now, Western media has also reported this week, which includes The Guardian, that a group of high-ranking EU officials would go to China next week for urgent talks. And the main goal of the visit is expected to try and save the European automotive industry. Now, this is a classic case of don't bite off more than you can chew. So the Nexperia saga is going to continue.
So they went out and they made a fake commercial. The Reagan Foundation went crazy with Reagan. Ronald Reagan liked tariffs, and when necessary, he would use tariffs.
Donald Trump has accused the Canadians of a fake ad against his tariffs and that it was only created to interfere with the US Supreme Court and other courts ahead of their decisions over his trade measures. And he announced that he's terminating the trade talks happening with the US's second largest trade partner after Mexico. Canada accounts for around 14% of total trade last year with the United States. Donald Trump posted on social media, "Canada cheated and got caught. They fraudulently took a big buy ad saying that Ronald Reagan did not like tariffs, when actually he loved tariffs for our country and its national security." And then on Saturday, he's just imposed an additional 10% tariffs on Canada because of the ad. Trump posted on his Truth Social platform, "Because of their serious misrepresentation of the facts and a hostile act, I'm increasing the tariff on Canada by 10% over and above what they're paying now." What started as a satirical Ontario ad has turned out into a full-blown trade war escalation. Ronald Reagan was the undisputed towering leader in the recent history of the Republican Party. So when Canada used his words in his voice to say what Donald Trump is doing is wrong, it threatens not only his ego, since he wants to be seen alongside Reagan when it comes to his MAGA supporters, but it also gives ammunition to his detractors who say that his trade and tariff policy is wrong. Now, Trump has even suggested that the ad is using an AI voice.
The way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. Now, there are sound historical reasons for this. Let's impose tariffs on foreign imports. It looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. What eventually occurs is, first, homegrown industries start relying on government protection, and the semiconductors were a special case. We had clear evidence that Japanese companies were engaging in unfair trade practices that violated an agreement between Japan and the United States. In imposing these tariffs, we were just trying to deal with a particular problem, not begin a trade war.
The man who calls himself the Tariff King just got fact-checked by Ronald Reagan's ghost. So now you heard it in Reagan's own voice while being recorded for his radio speech on April the 25th, 1987. Ronald Reagan hated tariffs. In the full speech, he said it caused the 1930s depression in the United States through which he lived, and said that even in the case of the Japanese semiconductors, that he was forced to impose them because the Japanese were not living up to a trade agreement, and that such tariffs or trade barriers and restrictions of any kind are steps that I am loath to take. He mentions in his speech why it should never be used universally or for long periods. His thoughts are the antithesis of how Donald Trump unveiled his April the 3rd Liberation Day, the tariffs for the whole world to see. And he enthusiastically calls himself the Tariff Man, and has said that tariffs are the most beautiful words in the English dictionary. The average effective United States tariff rate has risen from around 2.5% at the start of 2025 to almost 18% now, which is the highest since 1934, according to the Budget Lab at the Yale University. However, since close to 80% of Canadian exports go to the United States, trade talks are essential for the country. The Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has already spoken to the Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who put out the ad to make him stop doing so, which he's agreed to do so. The issue for Ford, however, is that Ontario is the province that's most being affected by those auto and steel tariffs. Already, US automakers Stellantis and GM recently said that they're moving their plants back to the United States.
Is doing the right thing with Trump. He should be much more conciliatory, talk about accepting President Trump's requests.
According to the US, China doesn't get it. They need to be much more conciliatory. That is the US stand, and that's why the United States team is putting pressure on China just before they landed for talks in Malaysia. And then the meeting that is actually supposed to be held in a couple of days between the two leaders at the APEC Summit. That's why the United States opened its investigation into the Phase 1 trade deal that was done with China in 2020 on the eve of trade team talks in Malaysia. The Trump administration is also said to be considering a plan to curb software-powered exports to China, which go into laptops to jet engines. And they're going to be retaliating against Beijing's latest round of rare earth export restrictions. Now remember, on 10th of October, Trump said in his social media post that he would impose not only additional tariffs of 100% on China's US-bound shipments, but was also considering export controls on any and all critical software by 1st of November. That's where these considerations on software are coming in. The more action items you have open, the more there is to discuss to close. So it takes away the attention from the tariffs themselves. What the US side is just not getting, though, is that this whole hyperpower mindset isn't delivering for them any longer. China's got no intention and has no need to submit to the US any longer. Even India has remained remarkably strong despite Trump's pressure on them on the Russian oil, among other things. Xi's strategy, as the Wall Street Journal put it recently, and very aptly, is punch hard and concede little. It's the only game that Trump knows and plays. Currently, both the US and Chinese teams are in talks in Malaysia on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit. And just to confirm, China's top trade negotiator, Li Chengjiang, is also participating in the talks. Now, a couple of weeks back, Secretary Treasury Bessent labelled Li as unhinged and accused him of behaving in an aggressive and reckless manner during his last visit to Washington in August, and suggested that Li might have gone rogue.
This individual was very disrespectful, and this individual did not. He showed up uninvited in Washington.
Later, China's state news agency formally announced that Li Chengjiang has been removed from his post as the permanent representative of China to the World Trade Organization and the deputy permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva. Now, this got the media, especially Western media, all hyped up that he'd been moved from his position due to these Scott Bessent's comments. However, even then, Chinese commentators pointed out that the shift was more structural. It was taking away from him the Geneva and the WTO diplomatic role, which was given to someone else, so that Li could focus exclusively on the US and international trade negotiations. So it was not the dialing down of the wolf warrior persona that the Western analysts thought it was in response to Bessent's comments. Bessent, who himself also believed that he had been removed, he came on a show where that comment was made and he just laughed it off and said he'd rather focus here on Washington. So he must have been shocked to see him there on these talks. Now, the two sides have a lot on their agenda, including many actions from recent weeks that they need to get removed, including China's ban on various rare earths and the US blacklist entities list that's just tripled the number of Chinese companies that have come under its ambit. The Chinese are demanding a full capitulation, the removal of all US tariffs and export control measures. But balancing pressure with appeasement now forms the bedrock of both countries' strategies towards each other. So from Canada's outrage to Europe's chip crisis and China's quiet counter, the world isn't reacting to Donald Trump alone, it's basically reorganizing itself without him. And that may be the real story that we'll start to see in this week's summits in Asia. I'm Najma Minhas with GVS Deep Dive. Do share with me your thoughts. Have a great day.